Ukraine is preparing a referendum and elections, while Russia is continuing its war and continuing bombing Ukraine, also the Ukrainian rear, the Ukrainian cities and infrastructure and so on, that would, of course, put the United States in a very odd position, that it would be sort of pressuring Ukraine to follow its plan in a situation when obviously normal democratic processes are very difficult. That would be a very strange picture then. And then there could be pressure by the US in this sort of good case scenario to actually force Russia to have at least a temporary ceasefire during the preparation and the conduct of the elections and the referendum.
What is hidden in $12 trillion deal between Russia and USA? Is it possible to stop the war by spring and hold elections in Ukraine? EU reverse enlargement for Kyiv, myth or reality? All of this I am about to discuss with my guest, political analyst Andreas Umland. Andreas, thanks for being in our show.
Thanks for having me again.
Ukraine plans to hold presidential elections simultaneously with a referendum on a peace agreement with aggressor Russia this spring, amid US demands to organize the vote by May 15, 2026, the Financial Times reports. According to Ukrainian and European officials, Zelensky intends to announce plans to hold elections and referendum on February 24, the fourth anniversary of the Russian invasion. This move, according to the publication's sources, comes amid strong pressure from the White House on Zelensky to complete peace talks between Ukraine and Russia in the spring and hold elections by May 15. Otherwise, Kyiv risks losing security guarantees. What do you think about this construction and sequence?
I think the first thing what one has to mention here is that this US pressure on Ukraine to hold a referendum and then to accept Russian occupation of Ukrainian territories means that the Budapest Memorandum has been now not only violated by Russia, but also by the US. If you look at the articles of this short text, the US and Great Britain have accepted the Ukrainian borders, and Russia as well. Russia has violated this since 2014, in fact, already earlier, because there's also an article about economic pressure which cannot be exerted on Ukraine. But now the US seems to be joining Russia in violating the Budapest Memorandum, and that is insofar important because this memorandum is an appendix to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is one of the largest treaties of humanity, and one could argue one of the most important treaties of humankind, because it's preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the world. And so that is a quite important, I would say, step by the US going this way, exerting this pressure on Ukraine to not accept to accept Russian territorial gains via such a referendum. So I think that is the first thing one has to mention, because that is not just East European politics, it's world politics. And it should be noted by everybody across the world that that the US and Russia, two of the two largest nuclear powers, have now violated the logic of the non-proliferation regime in trying to now jointly, in a way, trying to force Ukraine to accept territorial losses and to not and by not accepting Ukrainian borders. I think that's the first thing. The other strange aspect of all of this is that we just had an opinion poll by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, which has established that over 50%, 52% of Ukrainians would not accept any territorial concessions to to Russia, even if that means that Ukraine cannot get security guarantees from the US. So this is a paradoxical then demand from Ukraine, because at least at the current in the current situation, it looks as if the referendum will not be successful, that the question of the referendum will be rejected by the majority. And so then the question is, why to have this referendum at all? And many other questions are there, of course. How can you have a referendum during war? And there's even the demand to have simultaneous elections as well, and also during wartime, before a ceasefire, apparently. So this is all. There's so many questions here emerging from all of that one can only be surprised. Also, we know from opinion polls that what could happen is, if there are, for instance, presidential elections, and if Valery Zaluzhny would become a candidate for the presidential elections, it could well happen that then Zaluzhny becomes Ukrainian president, and then the Ukrainian leadership, and something similar goes for the parliament, would become even more hawkish than it is currently. And so the effect would be the opposite of what perhaps people in Washington are hoping and expecting, that the Ukrainian position will be even more irreconcilable, and then nothing would be actually achieved with all of that. So this is I think a strange plan. The only positive twist I can imagine here that could have is that if now indeed, as the Financial Times announces, Zelensky agrees to this plan and announces it officially on 24th of February, then the question would be, of course, how Russia will then behave. And if we then have a situation that Ukraine is preparing a referendum and elections while Russia is continuing its war and continuing bombing Ukraine, also the Ukrainian rear, the Ukrainian cities and infrastructure and so on, that would, of course, put the United States in a very odd position, that it would be sort of pressuring Ukraine to follow its plan in a situation when obviously normal democratic processes are very difficult and are boycotted by, sabotaged by Russia. So that would be a very strange picture then. And then there could be pressure by the US in this sort of good case scenario to actually force Russia to have at least a temporary ceasefire during the preparation and the conduct of the elections and the referendum. Sort of obvious problem here is that if you have a war and if you have millions of internally displaced and externally displaced persons, how you will then conduct this election. The only solution I can imagine for that would be to use the DIA system, the electronic, passport system that Ukraine has for conducting this war, but for conducting, this referendum and this election. But I'm not familiar enough with these with the technical capabilities and whether this is really an option here, and whether one can use DIA for something like that. If that is possible, and if it's also secure enough, that is, of course, the main question here, then perhaps that can be conducted somehow. But in any way, to have an electoral campaign, to have media presentation of the different parties, to have a public conversation about the referendums questions and about the party programs under wartime will really be a stretch. And So this is a very sort of immature, I would say, plan. And for now, I cannot imagine that. The only option I see here is really to force Russia into at least a temporary ceasefire, so that at least some sort of preparation for the vote can be actually done.
If information which is reported in Financial Times is true, why Washington has set such a deadline, such a specific deadline?
Well, my suspicion is that it's very much connected to US domestic affairs, namely to Trump's wish to get the Nobel Peace Prize, to the upcoming midterm elections for Congress, and also to the popularity of Ukraine and Zelensky in the US. So my suspicion is that what Trump is fearing here is that Ukraine's fate could become a topic in the midterm elections for the Congress, which would be an unusual situation. Usually, foreign policy issues are not major topics in electoral campaigns, but here there could be an exceptional situation because of the high popularity of Ukraine and Zelensky in the US. And so he wants to somehow bring that to an end and then present himself in 2026 and also further on as a peacemaker. This is a very risky operation because Russia, of course, does not want a just peace for Ukraine. Russia will use a scenario like that to destabilize Ukraine. It will try to use this sort of domestic political process in Ukraine during wartime to bring instability to Ukraine. So, but that is maybe not so important for Trump. He has his own view of this, and my suspicion is also that he has bad advisors on Eastern Europe, and he gets information from the political fringe.
Do you agree that the main leverage which Washington is going to use to make this plan come true is security guarantees for Ukraine?
Yes, I guess that is something that is, very much now in the public. But for me, there is a certain internal inconsistency with all of that, because the already mentioned security assurances that the US has given to Ukraine from 1994 are, in my view at least, violated with this American pressure on Ukraine to de facto give up territory. That is exactly what the US promised not to do in 1994. So why should anybody believe in security guarantees from the US that are sort of given at the same moment in which the security assurances from 1994 are now violated by the US? So it's an internal contradiction. You either are consistent and then your guarantees will be taken seriously, but the US is sort of violating one promise and offering another promise at the same time. So to me, that doesn't really make sense. And also we had now the story with Greenland, which is obviously in contradiction to the very logic of NATO and to international law and so on. And only after some significant counter pressure from the European countries did Trump make a step back and say that he doesn't want to annex Greenland. So the trust for concerning these security guarantees is going to be low in Ukraine and elsewhere.
If US plans about elections and about referendum fail, what Washington will do, in your opinion?
Apart from then perhaps withdrawing the security guarantees, I think the actual leverage that the US has over Ukraine is the still apparently very important intelligence sharing that is going on between Ukraine and the US. So apparently a part, and perhaps even a large part, of the Ukrainian military operations is based on intelligence provided by the US and via satellites, via secret services, and via the various technical capabilities that the US has. There's a discussion on this issue, how important that is for Ukraine, and there have been statements, let's say, from France, which says it is already sort of replacing the US. But my impression is that this is still rather important for Ukraine, and of course then the US may decide to stop this intelligence sharing. Although it's an intelligence sharing, it's also it would be to the disadvantage of the US, because the US is also getting data from Ukraine and from the drone war, let's say, and is profiting also from this intelligence sharing. So the sale of some critical military hardware. So if, for instance, the US says it will not sell for Ukraine any more Patriot missiles, that would be a big problem for Ukraine.
Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service reported that Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev offered to the United States $12 trillion economic cooperation deal. Zelensky suspects that this potential deal can include agreements on Ukraine. Simply put, Russia desires to buy Ukraine from the USA for $12 trillion. What do you think about the possibility of making such a deal?
Yeah, one cannot include something like that. Although the number is of course fantastic, because the GDP of Russia per year is only $2 trillion, so around $2 trillion. So where should these $12 trillion come from? This is an absurd number, but one suspects here, of course, that behind this whole plan there may be some economic and
some experts say that China will not allow Russia to make this deal, because under such conditions, Beijing risks to lose its impact on Russia and also lose its raw appendage. What do you think about China's role in this context?
That is an interesting issue. My feeling is also that China will not support this scheme, because it would mean also that the US and Russia could then have some sort of relationship that would be contrary to Chinese interests. But also, as I see it, China is actually interested in a continuation of the war, because China is profiting from this war, from the sanctions regime against Russia, and it announces its desire for peace, but the actual behavior of China during the last 4 years indicates that China is supporting Russia in this war. Probably Russia would not be able to actually conduct this war without Chinese economic support, and that's why I can imagine that China will be against.
Mm-hmm. Munich Security Conference takes place this week. Everybody remembers Vice President Vance's speech at the last conference. A lot has changed since then. Greenland, deterioration of relations within NATO, more risks and uncertainties, Russian drones and jets in the European sky, Ukraine's energy sector is almost destroyed. What should we wait from the upcoming conference, and what shifts in global security could happen this year?
Well, after this article in the Financial Times, I think this will be a very interesting conference, because I guess that American plan will be a major topic there. But there are also other issues. There's Iran, there's Cuba, a lot of hot issues, really, which are about war and peace on various continents. And this will be interesting. The speech of Vance last year was, in a way, absurd, because it was about European domestic affairs. And the Munich Security Conference is, of course, not about domestic politics in Germany or in Great Britain, what Vance wanted to talk about, but it's about international security. And so I guess this will be a very different conversation this year. And Vance is, as far as I know, not coming this year to the conference. Instead, that Rubio is coming, and that should be an interesting conversation.
Bloomberg and Politico reported that European Union is preparing several options how Ukraine can become a member of EU as part of future peace deal. How do you assess potential efficiency of suggested steps sequence, and do you believe in logic of reverse enlargement?
A sort of membership light, a quick accession of Ukraine to the EU, I think would be great. I think that is a good plan, because it would bring Ukraine into the EU, even if only partially, in a very short time, or could bring Ukraine into the EU partially in a very short period. But so far, I cannot fully believe it, because it would be a small revolution for the European Union. So far, the approach of the European Union has always been a full preparation of a candidate for accession to the European Union. And then, if all of the conditions have been fulfilled, a full accession of the country to the European Union, although there have been already, let's say, with the accession of Cyprus, the partial accession of Cyprus de facto to the European Union, because of a part of Cyprus is occupied in the past. Still, a sort of quick accession for Ukraine would be a small revolution. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible now that we have this discussion. And that would be great, of course, if that happens in 2027. For me, the most important question here would be, if Ukraine indeed becomes a partial member of the European Union, will the Article 42 of the Treaty on European Union also be applied to Ukraine, which contains the mutual aid provision of the EU member countries? So the EU members are also in a military alliance through the Treaty on European Union. So far, this has not played much of a role for the European Union, because the EU is not a military, explicitly a military organization. But for Ukraine, that would be, of course, be one of the most interesting aspects of such a partial accession. Will it get the security guarantee via such a partial accession from the European Union?
Okay, let's imagine that reverse enlargement gets started. What will happen if Ukraine doesn't meet reform requirements?
Well, I mean, that is not, for me, actually the main question, because such a partial accession would also have a certain list of conditions, and it would simply only happen if these conditions are fulfilled. So I think that is then mainly a question of time, when Ukraine will fulfill these conditions. If it fulfills them earlier, then it will have this partial accession, and if later, then later. So that is the question. The question is here rather to the European Union: can it really secure? Can it really make possible such a partial accession. Currently, we have a situation where not even the first cluster for the accession negotiations is open because of the veto of Hungary. So if you cannot even open the accession negotiations, then how are you going to actually then have a partial accession happening? That is the big question here, and I would still think that still for a partial accession you would have to have a consensus of all 27 member states of the EU, and currently that consensus does not exist, and then the question would not be so much to Ukraine whether Ukraine fulfills the conditions, but rather to the EU whether it will actually have the necessary consensus to allow for a partial accession of Ukraine.
American right-wing television channel Newsmax will soon appear in Ukraine. As we know, its founder is friend of Trump, Christopher Rudy. How do you understand this decision? What is the real reason? Because it's hard to believe in a business one. Have you heard this information about new TV channel, new American TV channel in Ukraine?
Yeah, I've only heard about it and was a bit surprised. That will be interesting to see if that happens, because these sort of circles, I would say, of hard right-wing republicanism have usually been hostile to Ukraine and partly even pro-Russian, people like Tucker Carlson. So if suddenly a media that is either implicitly or explicitly anti-Ukrainian or implicitly or explicitly pro-Russian would start functioning in Ukraine, that would be interesting to observe what then happens. But I would say that may not be a bad development. I would rather be for such an experiment.
Andreas, thank you very much for this interview, and have a good day.
Thanks for having me again. It was an honor.
Yeah, goodbye.